You are listening to Harmony Sermons at Harmony Church in Sumter, South Carolina, and we love the fact you decided to join in on listening to this sermon today. But we also realize that there is no substitute in connecting with others. If you have any questions about visiting church, or if we can connect you to a local church wherever you are, please visit us at harmonychurchsumter.com. Cheers, and let's begin.
Well, it is officially the Christmas season now, and so I thought we'd start off this morning with a little Christmas game. Are you good with word games? Are you good with what they call anagrams? So here's the game. Santa Claus goes by several different names. I'm thinking specifically of 3 different names that Santa goes by. So we're going to put a few different anagrams on the screen, and you just need to figure out what the name for Santa Claus is that the anagram spells. And if you get it, just shout it out, okay? Makes sense? Here's the first one. Here's the first anagram. Dang, okay, wow. All right, very good. That was the easiest one. Here's the second one.
Well, I missed it. What was it? Father Christmas.
Oh, it's Father Christmas was the first one. What's this one? Saint Nick. Okay, this is going easier than I thought. Here's the last one. Is there one more? Okay, I had 3, and we don't have it on the screen, but the last one spelled Kris Kringle. Okay, I messed that up. Very good. I expected that to be considerably more difficult for you than it was. All right. I guess I'm not good with word games because I thought those were challenging. But the point is this, names tell us things, right? Names communicate things to us. And Santa Claus isn't the only one who goes by various names, so does God. And so this morning we're starting a new series of sermons that are going to take us through the Christmas season, and we're calling this series Noel, the significance of God's name in the Christmas story. Now, admittedly, the title of that series is a little insider baseball. Because of the Hebrew language, which the Old Testament was written in, God goes by various names and titles. And in the Hebrew language, the name of God is El, E-L. But that it always has another word attached to it. And those other words give us some kind of a description of who God is. So maybe you've heard God referred to as El Shaddai or El Elyon, or most famously at Christmas time, Emmanuel. And so I'm playing off the Christmas word Noel, N-O-E-L. Because this Christmas we want to look at some different names for God that will help us to know El. Now, some of my preacher buddies would say, if you have to explain the title that much, you probably should come up with a different name for it. And to that, I just say, no. They can do whatever they want in their church. I thought this was a pretty clever, creative title. But the title itself isn't that important. What I'm concerned about this Christmas is that we use the Christmas story to learn some really important things about this God that has revealed himself to us in some really profound ways. And so this morning, the name of God that we're going to explore is El Roi. It means the God who sees. And to investigate this, let me invite you to grab your Bible or a phone and go with me to the first book of the Bible, Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16. Now, you might know El Roi as the little boy from what cartoon? The Jetsons. Now, I have no idea if they took his name from Genesis 16 or not, but it's in this story that we learn that the God that we know and love and serve, he sees us. He sees you, and that is a very, very good thing. Now, Genesis chapter 16 falls within the larger story of God's covenant with a man named Abram. In Genesis chapter 12, you might remember, God called Abram to leave his homeland and everything that was familiar to him and to go, go to a new place and start a new life there. And God promises that he's going to make Abram into a great nation. And Abram believes. He trusts God. He trusts in God's promise, and he obeys God despite his wife Sarai's barrenness. His wife was not able to have children. And so Abram's like, God, I want to trust you. I want to believe you. But how are you going to make me into a great nation when my wife and I can't even have one baby? Well, God reaffirms his covenant with Abram. He appears to him in a dream or a vision one night. And he tells Abram that his descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And Abram believes God, but his wife still hasn't had a baby. Well, by the time we reach Genesis chapter 16, years have passed. Abram and Sarai are still waiting on God to fulfill his promise. They need a baby. And so what they do in the part of the story that we're going to look at today is they try to help God out with this promise. They try to intervene and rush God's promise, and it leads to absolute chaos. And so this story of Abram and Sarai, really, this is our story in a lot of ways. It's about this desire that we sometimes have to want to take control of our life and to help God out and to not trust God for His timing in our lives. And honestly, maybe you're there right now this Christmas season. Maybe you have been waiting on God to fulfill a promise that He's made to you. Maybe you're waiting on God to answer a prayer request that you've been praying about. And maybe this holiday season, you're kind of like Abram. You're like, God, what gives? Are you there? Do you care about me? Do you care about this situation? The way that I want to walk through this passage this morning is I want to look at three headings. The temptation to take control, the consequences of trying to take control, and then finally, we're going to look this morning at the God who is in control. And through it all is this super encouraging name of God that has been revealed to us that's going to help us see that we don't have to be in control of our lives because God is El Roy. He's the God who sees you. So first of all, the temptation to take control. Notice how the story starts off, chapter 16, verse 1. It says, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family. And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. So Sarai knew that she was, from a human perspective, incapable of having a baby. God had specifically named Abram as the father of the promised heir, but he hadn't identified the mother. Now, logically, you would think that it would be Abram's wife, but hey, Sarai's thinking, who knows, maybe God had other plans. So what is Sarai doing here? She's second-guessing God. And friends, that is a really dangerous thing to do. We even get little glimpses here that maybe Sarai is blaming God. In verse 2, she says, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Hey, this is God's fault. This is God's doing. He's the one that's behind all of my pain and misery. So what happens? Well, Sarai comes up with this brilliant plan to give her slave, a woman named Hagar, to Abram, and he's going to try and have a baby with her, and then Sarai and Abram will then raise that baby as their own. Now, this was actually a common practice in that day. This would not have been out of the ordinary. Now, this was certainly not a part of God's original plan. He frowned upon this kind of thing, but this was something that was done. So what's happening here is that Abram and Sarai are unwilling to wait on the Lord to fulfill His promise, and instead they rushed ahead with their own plans. They acted to please themselves and not to glorify God. They were not at all obeying the Lord, and what they did certainly didn't bring peace and joy to their heart, to their home. As a matter of fact, look at what happens next, verse 4. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. So, surprise, surprise, when Hagar gets pregnant with Abram, Sarai is immediately jealous, and she starts to treat poor Hagar poorly. Friends, this is the temptation that we all have at times. It's this temptation to try and take control or hurry up and rush the promises of God in our lives. As I was thinking about that this week, I remembered back to Christmas of 1992. Back in the early 90s, I was a huge basketball fan. I was a big NBA fan. And if you know basketball, what happened in the summer of 1992 in the basketball world? Anybody remember? The Dream Team, the greatest basketball team ever assembled. It was the United States Olympic basketball team. They went into the Summer Olympics, just wreck shop, just destroyed every team that they played. Well, I was in basketball heaven. I loved it. Well, fast forward a few months. It's getting close to Christmas, and I'm wondering, I wonder what Mom and Dad are going to get me for Christmas. So one afternoon when they weren't home, I did some snooping. Went into their closet, snooped around a little bit, found my Christmas gifts, including a Dream Team t-shirt. I was like, oh baby, I love this shirt. I cannot wait to wear this shirt. But I didn't want to wait until Christmas to wear the shirt. So when Mom and Dad got home, I made up some lie that I needed to look for something in their closet, and would you believe it? I just happened to find that Dream Team t-shirt that you got me. And I'm really sorry that I saw it. I know it's not going to be a surprise for Christmas. I'm sorry about that. But I don't mind. It's not that big of a deal to me. So, Mom, Dad, you should probably just go ahead and give me that shirt right now. And I think Mom said something like, I was born at night, but not last night. Like, I know you were snooping around for your gifts. And so not only are you not going to get the shirt now, you're not even going to get the shirt for Christmas. I mean, she made me wait like an extra 4 months to eventually get that shirt. Now, what was my mistake? My mistake was that I tried to take control and rush the gift that was going to be given to me. You ever do that with God? You ever fall into the temptation of trying to take control? Maybe that's exactly where you are this Christmas. Maybe for you, you really want to be in a romantic relationship. And you're trusting God and you're waiting on God to bring you a godly man or a godly woman, and it's just not happening. And so maybe your temptation is to take control and lower your standards a little bit and date somebody who isn't committed to Jesus like you are. Or maybe for you, you're trying to get ahead financially. You're trusting God with your money and your finances, but things just are not moving as quickly as you'd like. And so maybe you are seriously considering cutting some corners and pulling back on the generosity that God has called you to. Maybe you're even thinking about engaging in some dishonest practices to get ahead financially. Parents, grandparents, maybe you're having a really tough time trusting God with your children or grandchildren. And maybe your temptation is to try to micromanage your children or grandchildren's lives instead of just leaving them with the Lord. Maybe you've been praying for God's will about some kind of really big life decision, and honestly, maybe God has not yet given you clarity about it yet. And so the temptation that you're facing is to move ahead anyways without that clarity from the Lord. Friends, when you try and help God like Sarah did, when you try and rush the promise, you just end up complicating things. And so that takes us to the second heading, the consequences of trying to take control. Notice how the story goes on, verse 5. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you." Abram replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. So, the whole plan backfires. Hagar, the slave woman, gets pregnant, and now that she's pregnant with Sarai's husband, she gets an attitude. She gets a little arrogant and cocky, and she starts treating Sarai poorly. So Sarai starts to blame Abram, and she starts to mistreat Hagar. She seems to have forgotten that she was the one that came up with this little scenario in the first place. And then Abram's solution was to just give in to his wife and abdicate his spiritual headship in the home. He's totally apathetic here. He should have had pity for this helpless slave girl that he impregnated, but instead he's allowing his wife to mistreat her. I mean, look at the sins represented here. You've got pride, you've got jealousy, you've got apathy. Friends, when you follow the wisdom of the world, you will always end up warring like the world. We've got a three-way fight going on here. Instead of facing their sins honestly, each of these people took a different course, and it only made things worse. The sin grew and grew and grew. There are consequences to trying to take control. I saw this story the other day. About 35 years ago, there was a woman in Washington State, and she started to feed a raccoon that was in her yard. She would just put food out into the yard, and the raccoon would come and eat it. And I assume it's not the same raccoon, but 35 years later, she still does that. She puts food out for the occasional raccoon. Well, early in the month of October, she was out running errands, and she pulled into her driveway. She got out of her car to walk toward her house. She walked around the corner, and there were over 100 very aggressive raccoons in her yard wanting to be fed right then. She stopped in her tracks. The raccoons came at her. She made a beeline. She ran back to her car. She got in her car. And those 100 raccoons literally surrounded her car wanting lunch. So she calls 911. Animal control had to come. What happened? This thing that she thought that she could control got way out of hand. It grew bigger and bigger and bigger until she could no longer manage it. And I saw that story and I thought, man, what a perfect analogy for what sin does in our lives. This is exactly what happened in this story. And so it got so bad that Hagar decides to run away. We're going to be told here in a minute that she heads south to a place called Shur. This is northeast of Mount Sinai. Now, where's she going? Well, she's heading back home to Egypt. And I want you to notice the irony for God's people in this story. Because here we have an Egyptian slave freeing an oppressive master, and she's running through the wilderness of Sinai, where she's going to be met here in just a minute by an angel of the Lord who's going to lead her and protect her. In a few generations' time, the shoe's going to be on the other foot. It's going to be the people of God. It's going to be Abram's future offspring that are going to be enslaved by Egyptians. And Moses will eventually free them from slavery. Now, who wrote the book of Genesis? Who wrote Genesis 16? Moses did. Do you think that as he was writing this down, a light bulb might have gone off in his mind? Do you think he was like, oh my goodness, before Egypt did this to us, we did this to an Egyptian? Now, not for centuries and not on the same scale, but just as the Egyptians were the oppressors to the people of God, now Abram and Sarai, the people of God, are oppressing this Egyptian woman. Do you see the mess that we make when we try to take the control that God has? Friends, how's that working out for you to try and rush the promise of God in your life? Has it led you to peace? There's a lesson here for us, and the lesson is this: stick to the problems that God has given you. Like, don't go out and make new ones on your own. We don't always understand why God allows some of the things that He allows to come into our life. But we do know this: when God providentially allows things to come into your life, God always has a reason. So is there some place right now in your life that you're compromising? Maybe it seems like a really small compromise, but is there a place in your life this Christmas season where you are tempted to do things your own way because God's way doesn't seem to be working? Maybe for you, maybe it's cheating on a test. Or maybe it's lying to cover your tracks. Maybe it's taking a job that pays a little bit more money, but if you were honest with yourself, you know it's not going to be a good job for you or your family. Maybe you're going along with some questionable stuff at work or school. You know it's not right, but it's like, God, doing things your way just doesn't seem to be working anymore, and so I think I need to find another way. The question that you need to ask yourself is this: is God able to come through for me without my help, or does He require a little bit of my assistance? Listen, don't complicate your life more by taking matters into your own hands. One of the things that I love most about the Christmas season is watching Christmas movies with my family. So every December we have a big list of Christmas movies that we work through, and we always save the best ones for last, so like Home Alone, Christmas Vacation. We won't watch those for another couple of weeks. But one of the movies that we will often watch in December is The Santa Claus with Tim Allen. You ever see that movie? So Tim Allen plays Scott Calvin, and he accidentally injures Santa on Christmas Eve. Scott accidentally startles Santa, and Santa falls off Scott's roof, and he falls to the ground, he gets injured, and through a whole series of events, Scott puts on the Santa suit, and he gets in Santa's sleigh, but what he doesn't realize is that by putting on the suit, he has made a commitment. He has committed to a change in identity. So this is the Santa Claus right here. In putting on the suit and entering the sleigh, the wearer waives any and all rights to any previous identity, real or implied, and fully accepts the duties and responsibilities of Santa Claus. He has committed to a change in identity. And friends, it's the same for us. When you become a Christian, you are committing to a brand new identity. It's an identity that says, God now runs my life. I do what He says to do. I trust Him completely. I give Him complete and full rights over my life, and I will wait for Him to act and move, and I'm going to refuse to fall into the temptation of trying to take control of my life and my future. Because I realize that when I do that, it is not honoring to God, and there will be consequences for me. Friends, beware of trying to take control of your life when God just simply says, hey, leave your life in my hands. I've got this. And so that leads us to the third heading that we see in this story, the God who is in control. So remember, Hagar has run away. She's out in the desert by herself as a pregnant woman. This is a very dangerous situation. And notice what happens. We'll pick the story up here in verse 7. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, "Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going?" She replied, "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai." The angel of the Lord said to her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her authority." The angel of the Lord said to her, "I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count." The angel of the Lord said to her, "You have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. This man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives." Now, kind of a strange little scenario that we have going on here. An angel of the Lord appears to Hagar. 58 times in the Old Testament we have this phrase, the angel of the Lord. Another 11 times it talks about the angel of God. Now, there's all kinds of speculation about who or what the angel of the Lord is. But here's what I think. I think that this is not so much a representative of God as it is a representation of God. I believe that what we're seeing right here is what we call a theophany. That this was God himself. This was a pre-incarnate Jesus Christ that appears to the slave woman. We see this a few other times in the Old Testament where God himself appears to people and has interactions with them. So the angel of the Lord here is more than likely the angel that is the Lord. In verse 10 it says, "The angel of the Lord said to her," and verse 11 it says the same thing, "The angel of the Lord said to her," but then notice what it says at the end of verse 11, "For the Lord has heard your cry of affliction." In other words, at first it's referred to as the angel of the Lord, but then just the Lord. There is the identification of God himself here. And God tells her to do something very, very difficult. He says, "I want you to go back to Abram and Sarai. I want you to have the baby, and I want you to submit to them." You know, sometimes God confronts our sinfulness and our foolishness and our attempt to play God and take control, and he tells us to do hard things. And when we finally decide to obey God after we've rebelled against him, here's what I found in my own life. The obedience required is usually more difficult than it would have been if we just obeyed God in the first place. But despite the tough news to go back to her home, go back to her situation with Abram and Sarai, look at the blessing God gives her in verses 10 and 12. Her son Ishmael, man, he's going to have a complicated history. He's going to be a wild man. He's going to be against everybody, and everybody's going to be against him. This is foretelling the difficulties that there's going to be in this family, difficulties that we still see to this day. Of course, the Muslim people came from Ishmael. The Jewish people came from another son that Abram would go on to have with Sarai. But the promise is that even though Hagar is not going to be in the line of promise, she's still connected enough to Abram that she is going to be blessed. This is what God is telling her here. And I want you to notice this. I want you to notice the tender, compassionate care of God. You know, Hagar's name has been mentioned several times in this story already, but did you notice that Abram and Sarai never mention her name once? To them, she's my servant, or that Egyptian girl. They don't even call her by her name. Who calls her by her name? God does. And this is pretty astounding. Scholars have pointed out that this is the only known instance in ancient Near Eastern literature where God addresses a woman by name. Abram and Sarai will not name her, but the Lord does. He calls her by her name, Hagar. So what does Hagar do? Well, look at verse 13. Here's where the story starts to get good. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, "You are El Roy." For she said, "In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me?" What does she do? She gives God a name. El Roy, the God who sees me. Now again, this is astounding. Because to the best of my knowledge, this is the only time in the entire Bible where somebody gives God a new name. Now there's different occasions where people give a God-like name to a place, like Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is my banner, or Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. Those were names that were given to a place. This is the only time, I think, that somebody gives God himself a new name. And who does it come from? The lowly foreign servant Hagar. She says, "You are El Roy. You are the God who sees me." Friends, do you believe that God is El Roi? Do you believe that He sees you right now in your pain, or your depression, or your anxiety, or your confusion, or your frustration? He knows exactly what's going on in your life right now. It has not taken Him by surprise. You can rest in the fact that the God of the universe sees you. As a matter of fact, let me give you 3 actions that El Roi takes. First of all, El Roi reveals God's character. He is not distant or detached. He was with this hopeless slave woman, and He's with you right now this Christmas season, no matter what you feel like. Second of all, El Roi brings comfort in isolation. You are never, ever overlooked by God. Hagar felt totally isolated and alone, and yet God shows up and says, hey, I know who you are. I know what you've been through. I know what you've experienced. And the same is true for you. You may have been overlooked by people, but you are never, ever overlooked by God. Thirdly, El Roi gives us confidence for the future. He sees your present circumstances, and He has a purpose and a path for your life. God tells Hagar something difficult here. He says, I want you to go back to Abram and Sarai. I believe that this mess can be worked out. And friends, I just want to tell you that God's vision for your life, it extends beyond the present. He has plans for you. He has good plans for you. Now, here's where the Christmas story crosses paths with Hagar's story. Because think about this. Jesus Christ is the ultimate revelation of El Roi. God saw Hagar suffering, and what did He do? He intervened personally. Well, the Christmas story tells us that Jesus Christ did the exact same thing for us. This is the whole point of why He came, right? It was to identify with us. It was to intervene in the mess that we had made. Jesus is the one who knows what it's like to be in the wilderness like Hagar. Do you remember that story? Jesus went into the wilderness, the desert, for 40 days to fast and commune with God. And who appeared to Him there? Not an angel of the Lord, the devil. Right? The enemy came to tempt Him. Jesus is the one who gives comfort and hope for the future. This little baby that we celebrate at Christmas time, He was born and He grew up for one reason, to die. But then what did He do? He rose again, and He told us that He is the resurrection and the life. Do you know this Jesus? Is He real to you? Who is Jesus right now to you in the middle of your mess? He's the God that sees you. He knows what you're going through, and He knows exactly what you need. That this cute, snuggly little baby grew up to take the sin of the world on Himself. And He made a way for us to know God and be known by God and to be able to walk through life with God's presence available to us. You know, there's a church in Mexico that have made a very strange claim. They claim to have the tallest baby Jesus statue in the world. We have a picture here. Now, I don't see Jesus so much. I do see a little bit of Nicolas Cage, or I actually see Phil Collins there, right? Now, that's just kind of creepy. But one of the temptations at Christmas time is to look at Jesus as a big baby, right? We're going to keep Him in the manger because He's cute, and He's sweet, and He's innocent, but he's little baby Jesus. He's not really big enough to handle the problems in my life. And I just want to tell you that this Jesus that we celebrate at Christmas time, this Jesus who was born to enter into the mess of humanity, He would grow up to take all the sins that you and I have committed on Himself, and He would pay for them and die for them. And He is big enough to handle that painful, confusing issue that's going on in your life right now. Friend, do you believe that this Jesus sees you and knows exactly what's going on in your life? Do you believe, do you trust that He's powerful enough to help you in such a way that you don't have to try to take control of your life and manipulate the situation to get what you want? He is El Roi. He sees you. You can trust in Him, and He's worthy of your praise this Christmas. Let's pray together. God, we're grateful and thankful for these stories that You have preserved in your word for us, Lord. And while the circumstances and the situation might be different for us, Lord, every one of us knows what it's like to be in that situation that Abram and Sarai were in, that Hagar was in. God, we know what it's like to long for something that we feel like we're missing in our lives. We know what it's like, Lord, to mess up the situation and make the situation even more complicated. And that's why, God, we are so grateful and thankful for your Son, Jesus, that tells us that we can trust him, that he knows what's best for us. And God, when we fail, when we mess up, when we just make a mess of our lives or our situation, we're thankful, God, for the forgiveness and grace that Jesus offers us. So, Father, I pray that as we kick off this Christmas season, I pray that over the next 4 weeks, as we focus on your Son coming to this earth in a special way, I pray, Lord, that you'd meet with us. And I want to pray for my brothers and sisters that are here right now. Lord, I'm sure that there's all kinds of confusing, painful messes that are represented here this morning. Lord, would you meet with each of us in a powerful way? Would you remind us of the presence of Jesus Christ in our lives? God, I pray that you would get each one of us to the point where we can open our hands to you and say, God, I don't want to be in control of my life anymore. I trust you. Father, I pray that you would meet with us in a special way and that you'd remind us of that truth over the next few weeks. We pray all these things in Jesus' name.